Welcome everyone. My name is Carla Abreu and I'm Community and Program Manager from Singularity University, Portugal, working together with Nova Business School of Economics in this initiative. I have the pleasure to be your host for today's webinar, The Opportunity of a Lifetime, an initiative that is part of the Role to Play campaign promoted by Nova that aims to help our community to deal with several challenges in the current context. This session will be co-presented by two amazing and inspiring neuroscientists, Misha Byrne, social neuroscience and performance expert, and also member of Singularity University, Portugal. With a background in researching the brain mechanism, he specializes in taking the latest insights from neuroscience and creating real-world business applications. And also Crystal Dilworth, a dancer, a science communication expert that has been working as a consultant in the business sector, helping companies to use neuroscience to design a clear communication strategies that move the human behavior. Due to the fact that this session is being pre-recorded, we have an email so that you can send us your questions that will be answered later on by our guests. The email is info@suportugal.org. And now, to learn more about this session and get the opportunity of a lifetime to transform self-isolation into an opportunity to achieve mastery, I'll leave you with Misha and Crystal.
Thank you, Carla. It's wonderful to be here for a conversation rather than a formal sort of presentation. And I'm so excited to be joined by my dear friend and close colleague, Crystal Dilworth, Dr. Crystal Dilworth. This presentation came out of some conversations that we've been having over the last 3 or 4 weeks as the world has responded to COVID and as each of us have moved countries to be back close to our loved ones, and reflecting on how all of us are busy resetting our work, our home lives and our performance. Crystal and I met many years ago working on projects together. And we bonded very quickly because we have a shared passion for neuroscience and for how we can bring neuroscience to the world and make the world a better place in a very practical way. What I didn't know until relatively recently is all of the other weird and wonderful things that you've done, Crystal, over the last few years.
There's so many dot points there.
At one point you said when you were doing your PhD at Caltech, which is the #1 university in the world, for molecular neuroscience, you taught PhD students in physics how to dance like they were in Star Trek and did a full 2-hour performance. That can't be easy.
No, I was actually the choreographer in residence at Caltech for several years, and I taught everything from undergraduates to senior NASA engineers that had worked on things that had gone to space, how to use their bodies and how to dance and how to step out of their comfort zone.
And so, we started a conversation and I said, well, how on earth do you get people to learn something so hard? And your answer was just don't tell them that it's hard. And you first learnt this, it turns out, when you were being homeschooled and you did your first university courses when you were 14. I find that a little amazing myself. I'm a bit intimidated by it.
I don't think there's anything to be intimidated by. It's not knowing any better, right? And that's sort of one of the things that we want to talk about today, I think, which is if you find yourself in an unexpected situation, how can you move through that and still accomplish the goals that you want to accomplish? Like I just, because of the way that my life turned out, never did anything conventionally. So I have a few tips and tricks that I use when I'm adapting to new situations that I'm happy to share.
Yeah. And, perhaps a good place for us to start is what do we know from a neuroscience perspective about how the brain learns? And this first point, I think, is really important, that we're all designed to go through periods of big change. Our brain is actually quite good at it. But the last time all of us went through this much change, it was a bit of a while ago.
Yeah, the brain was still developing and it was still responding and wiring itself to the new environment. So if you think about all of the things that are different when you're a kid, and your job is to learn and change and grow and look at what's going on around you and adapt to it, versus now when you're an adult and you just want things to slow down so that you can do your work and be successful. Things have changed a lot for us now. And maybe we can take some ideas from how children respond to their environment to help us adapt to our new normal. I love this picture of you, Mish.
Yeah, yeah, back on that last one, I couldn't stop because, of course, when you're young, your brain is wired to be constantly learning. And so there's a whole lot of chemical processes that go on to make sure that you can adapt and change. Of course, one of the hidden things that you also have to support your learning is sleep, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And I don't know how much sleep everyone on the line is getting at the moment, but it's worth noting that when the brain's going through lots of change, kids tend to sleep a lot, right? So this is just one of many simple hacks that you can actually look at to improve your learning. So the brain can learn, but it needs a lot of support if it's going through a lot of learning. The second, observation is that learning takes time. Tell us a bit about this. This is a photo that you were involved in taking.
What do these two seemingly disparate photos have in common? Well, this picture is of two orangutan adults and one junior. It was taken by my partner in the Sumatran jungle. He studies orangutan behavior, which, coincidentally isn't that much unlike human behavior, since our brains are quite similar. And when we talk about learning takes time, orangutans actually stay with their young for the longest amount of time out of any of the great apes, except for humans. And that's because their social relationships are quite complex. Their environments are quite complex. There's a lot of eat this, don't eat that, do this, don't do that. And it takes almost a decade for young orangutans to learn how to be orangutans so they can go out into the world. And this other photo.
Now that I've got to relearn all of my ways of working with my colleagues, it's not going to happen overnight.
It is definitely not going to happen overnight. Just the way that taking, someone that is one of the few people in the world that's ever driven a robot on another planet, and putting them in the middle of a theater and saying, okay, great, you're going to be in a musical and now you're going to tap dance. That doesn't happen overnight either, but that's also something that I kind of have experience in helping to facilitate.
Yeah, you do indeed. So this next observation is actually from my research when I was in the lab several years ago. I did a lot of research into how the brain learns, and in particular, what happens when you get feedback. The one thing that all those people on the screen have in common is that they all thought that one thing was going to happen and then something else happened. And what's really interesting in the brain is that when you plan for one thing, but your performance doesn't quite measure up, your brain tries to help by taking away your very own favorite pleasure drug, which is called dopamine. So I don't know if anyone on the line has heard of dopamine before. It feels great when you have it. It's the sort of thing you have when you have a nice glass of red wine or when you're watching a great TV show, having a nice hug. When you make a mistake and you have to learn, your brain takes away dopamine and it fires up your frontal lobe and helps you to think and plan, but it doesn't feel very nice. And so unexpected learning, like we're all going through at the moment, can actually be a little bit unpleasant. And you have this great quote, which I love, which is that dopamine is actually the final reward for everything in the brain.
Yeah, it keeps us alive. It tells us what is going to keep us alive and keep us going. And that's why the brain releases that neurotransmitter and says, this is good for you. So eating is good for you. Being with friends is good for you. And it gives you dopamine as a positive reward for that. So when I say give me dopamine or give me death, dopamine as a reward system is really what's kept us alive and evolving as a species.
And of course, what's interesting about that is we can get a bit addicted to dopamine. And when you take it away suddenly, like when you have to change all of your habits, it actually feels a little bit uncomfortable and it can take some effort to stay in a constructive learning space.
It's definitely a double-edged sword. I mean, my PhD research was in nicotine dependence. So when you have too much dopamine for the wrong reasons, it can certainly go awry.
Yeah, exactly. But then this last bit, which leads into the main focus of today's talk, is, of course, learning is a skill. And this is something that, for anyone on the line who's a specialist educator or a teacher will know all too well. You can teach anyone most things by trial and error over and over again, and you keep getting it wrong and you try it, but it's not the most efficient way to learn. It turns out that one of the things that humans are very, very good at is having a strategy for learning more effectively. And so as we're all facing this big challenge of how do I learn from home? How do I help my kids learn? How do I help my team at work learn to do things in a different way? There's an easy way to learn and there's a hard way to learn. And at least for us, we think, why not use the easy way if you can?
Yeah, work with your brain's natural processes to facilitate the type of learning that you want.
Yeah. And so that sort of brings us to, our thought around the purpose of this conversation today, which is we're hoping that we can help upskill each of you on the line to learn a little bit more effectively over the coming weeks and months. And we'd like to do that by sharing just 3 neuroscience-based tips that you can apply in your own life to be a more effective learner. And hopefully in the process, get to spend less time struggling with the learning and a little bit more time having the kind of impact that you want with your family, with your friends, with your teams, and with your communities.
Yeah, stop fighting your brain and work with it.
Yeah, exactly. Work with the brain because it's so much easier when you do. So let's have a look at this first tip. And the first tip is around how can you optimize your brain's learning environment. There are so many different things that we can look at here, and we don't have the time to go into all of them today, but just some examples. We've discovered that the food that you eat within half an hour to an hour has an impact on chemical levels in your brain and can have a huge impact on your learning state. It's obvious with things like coffee, right? Some of us have a cup of coffee or need a couple of cups of coffee before we get into the day. But the diet that you have and the food that you eat has a huge impact. So a lot of us, now that we've gone from being at work all day and eating lunch in our favorite shops to now maybe being at home and having to cook food, are sort of forgetting to have lunch. And around about 3 or 4 o'clock, they're finding we really struggle. I don't know if anyone is guilty of that. I know I am. Little things like the food that you eat have a huge impact. Music, interestingly, and the amount of background noise. So you may have been used to working, learning, performing in an office with lots of people talking behind you, and now you're in an office, in your home office with no one around, or it might be the reverse. It turns out all of us need a certain amount of background noise to get the activity levels in our brain right to be able to focus and learn. And so to have a think about, have I got the right noise environment? Sleep is a really important one, which I mentioned already. It turns out as soon as you drop below about 8 hours of sleep, it starts to impact on your performance and your ability to learn. Even though between 6 hours and 7 hours, you sort of think, I'm okay, I should be all right. Turns out that those extra couple of hours do make a difference if you can find them. But then perhaps the biggest one that is close to my heart, because I'm a social neuroscientist, is the person standing on the left. And it turns out from lots of different research that you have a social brain. And what that means is that the tribe that you have around you has a huge impact on your learning. Now, what that means, of course, is we need to choose our tribe carefully. And Crystal, you've got lots of stories in each of these areas about how you've managed to make it easier for people to learn by managing the social environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that social contract is so important. It's not just who's around you, but how you've agreed to be and how to work with each other, right? And our brains are so sensitive to that environment because they have to be. When you think back to that image of the baby orangutan, they're so dependent on the social environment around them for survival, right? It's not just the food and the shelter that's important, but it's the social group that's going to protect them and provide for them. And so if you think about your survival and your learning in that same context, who is around you? How are they helping you to facilitate the things that you need to learn? Who can you reach out to create the environment that your brain wants? And how can you share the load so that you're not alone and forcing your brain to work in a different way, but together as a group, as a team, you're moving forward to where you all want to be. It's, that's just using your brain's sort of evolved processes and evolved sensitivities to get you where you want to go.
And that last one is really important from my perspective. We sort of know that we work as a team, but then when we start working from home and we're all facing a big challenge, everyone sort of feels like, well, I should be able to do all of it. And I all of a sudden need to go from 0 to hero in a very short space of time. A much better approach from your brain's perspective is share the load. You don't all have to be masters at Zoom. Get some help from someone who finds it easy, and maybe you can offer them some help in some other area. How can we make this a team sport, not something that's just on each one of us individually? Absolutely. So that first idea is, how can we create the right environment for learning, especially your social environment? The second one we wanted to talk about, the second tip, is to set the right expectations for learning, because it turns out that your brain is very, very responsive to expectations, especially the ones you set for yourself. There's a wonderful neuroscience study. What they did was they put people in a brain scanner so we could see what's happening in their brain, and showed them pictures of a car accident and some people who'd been injured in that. And you can imagine, what that's like to see some quite unpleasant photos. Not surprisingly, people's emotional system gets very activated. People feel quite upset, and there's a lot of concern. Now, what's interesting here is it turns out you can change all of that brain activity very, very simply. And what the researchers did was they asked those people who were looking at those photos one simple request. They said, I'd like you to imagine that instead of just being a bystander watching, that you're a first responder. You're an ambulance worker, maybe a policeman, you're a trained person, and your job is to help these people deal with this situation.
And the people in the scanner don't have those skills. They're just told that
No,
they do.
Exactly. They've never been trained. They've been given no new skills, no new information, but their brain changes completely. And I don't know if you can, anyone on the line can guess what happens. The emotional system settles down, and the frontal lobe, this thinking, planning part of the brain, starts to fire up to solve problems and come up with strategies. So just by asking someone to shift their role, and this is of course why Nova's initiative around role to play is so powerful and so wonderful, because by shifting our role from victim or bystander to an active participant, your brain becomes so much more resourceful very, very quickly. And so we've got a range of suggestions there around the kinds of expectations that you might be setting for yourself or for others. My favorite example is, some of us might have a child, maybe a teenage child who's supposed to be doing their homework and won't. And so we say to them in frustration, you just need to sit there. Why? Because I said so. Sit there and do your homework. You need to sit there. Now, what does their brain say at that point? It says, my role is to sit there. Not my role is to learn. Not my role is to make the best of this situation. So these little things can set big expectations. Find a positive motivation, because just responding to the stress ends up keeping us in fight flight, and we end up feeling quite exhausted after a while. And then this third one, which I'd love you to share a bit about, Crystal, is acknowledge when it's hard, but don't focus too much on what's hard.
Yeah, I think it's okay to acknowledge when you're struggling, but telling yourself that something is going to be hard to do is basically promising that it's going to be hard to do. I mean, I was lucky enough when I was younger to be trained as a musician using the Suzuki method. And one of the foundations of that method's philosophy is that you don't tell kids that it's difficult to play Vivaldi concerto on the violin. You just teach them how to play that Vivaldi concerto. And then you know what? They do it. And you have 5, 6-year-old, very, very little kids that are learning pieces that they really have no business playing because nobody told them that they just weren't supposed to know how to do that. And I think that you can apply that philosophy to your own work. If you tell yourself this is interesting, it might be challenging, but I'm going to get there, you know what? Your brain's going to believe you.
Helps you after a while, absolutely. So they're the first 2 tips. Take care of the environment, whether it's food, sound, music, distraction, extra noise, less noise, and the social environment. Number 2, we want you to think carefully about the expectations that you're setting for yourself or for other people. And then this third idea is to aim for flow. Now, flow is really interesting. The first research into flow was done in the 1970s. So we've known about this for a while. It turns out that when you look across countries, cultures, different organizations, people's very best moments when they felt most excited, alive, and positive don't actually happen when we're relaxing on a beach on holiday. They tend to happen when we're fully engaged in some task or challenge or opportunity, a piece of work, some new challenge. But it's really interesting, the ingredients for this excited, present flow state. You need to feel challenged. And a lot of us are feeling challenged at the moment by big changes, lots of uncertainty. But you also need to feel skilled, like you have strengths. And when you have those 2 things together, when you're in an area of strength and you're being challenged, then this feeling of flow starts to emerge. And you found this, Crystal, again, I think in your in your work with your PhD students and physicists learning how to dance.
Yeah, it's amazing what happens when you tie things that are scary and big to something that you already know that you're good at. I mean, when you get a bunch of scientists and engineers on a stage with the lights in their face suddenly going, why the heck did I audition for a musical? This is crazy. I thought it was going to be a fun thing to do in my spare time, and now I feel vulnerable and exposed, and I'm going to suck and it's going to be awful. You know, like, calming that seems daunting, but it's actually, I found not that hard. I use humor, and I tie what I'm asking them to do to something that they already know. So basically I math shame them. You know, they know they're good at math. And so when I need a straight kick line, you know, like a chorus line, you see like can girls, and it's just crooked and weird, I say, guys, I asked for a line, you're giving me a plane. I'm wanting something in one dimension, you're giving me something in two. Do you need me to explain to you the difference between a line and a plane? But these are some of the smartest people.
You're using physics to teach physicists how to dance the tap dance. I like that.
Yeah, and then suddenly realize that they actually have a frame for at least that particular task. And, you know, that usually happens every year, at least once. And then the line is never crooked again, because they know that. They know how to do that. And it's great watching that snap in.
I love it. So they're three simple places to start. And we've got such a short amount of time this evening, but I think that's a good place to start for learning. Step one, have a look at the environment. Step two, set the right expectations. And step three, make sure you focus on this flow state, which is building from strength and enjoying the challenge rather than feeling like you're out of your depth. As a final thought, you know, why is it worth doing this? And the answer is because the human brain can do amazing things. It can put people on the moon, but it's very expensive to run. It costs a lot of oxygen, a lot of sugar, a lot of everything. And so we all sort of need to spend our energy and effort wisely. Crystal, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. The funny thing about brains is they're expensive to run and they're inherently lazy. So they'll take the path of least resistance. So my suggestion as a neuroscientist is, if you want to get to a different place than you usually go, spending your energy wisely, nudging your brain onto that new path. I usually lay crumbs of dopamine, so you get a little bit of reward for doing something differently, is a way of getting there. But again, setting your expectations. It's not going to be an overnight transformation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as a very final thought, to remember it is possible to get to that flow state, because we're all dealing with 1,000 crazy things every day at the moment. And some days we wake up happy, some days we wake up not so happy, but it is possible to find this flow state for each of us. And so that's perhaps where we'll leave it for today, but looking forward to discussing some questions.
Okay, here we are. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. And if possible, we would like to ask you both some questions. The first one is the idea that the human brain is expensive is very powerful. So how can we deal with so many inputs that we have no control on it, to think what is really important in that moment? You want to answer?
Yes, well, part of it is to be kind to yourself. So I'm quite passionate about this, actually, because, you know, a lot of us are thinking we should be there overnight. You know, we're sort of looking at, you know, all these LinkedIn articles where people seem to be coping very, very well with all of the change that's going. And we think, geez, I should be able to do that too. Of course, everyone's going through a bit of a difficult time at the moment, and adapting and responding and getting up and being human every day. What really helps the brain do better is to be a bit kind to it, rather than sort of punishing your own brain when you think it's not doing what you want. Turns out being a bit nice to it actually helps release a bit of the dopamine a bit faster. But Crystal, I'm interested in your comments as well.
Yeah, it's interesting for someone that studies failure, which is sort of the brain's withholding of that positive reward when you do something wrong, that you're advocating for the opposite, which is really, you know, be kind and let your brain have rewards for the things that it's doing right. And I absolutely agree. And that's going to be very different, you know, for everyone. So knowing what makes you happy and what makes makes you motivated is really important. So spending some time to think about how your brain uses its expensive energy normally and what it normally is naturally like moving towards would be a really good personal exercise to know how you can set up your environment moving forward to be rewarding and to keep you motivated in the direction that you actually want to go.
Yeah. So the second one, it's much more two questions that you have given some nice tips about how the brain acts, and we would like to know how can we act our brain to something that we know that is painful for us. And the second one, which links also to the first one, is how do we find our best environment for our brain?
Well, you know, we were actually having a similar chat about this last week, I think it was, Crystal, and we had slightly different perspectives. My particular view around that is, you know, point one, as I said, be kind to your brain, but point two, little by little is often the way to go. What I found, you know, particularly for a lot of the people that I talk to is, you know, rather than trying to tackle a big problem all at once, maybe take it step by step. Because what the brain does is slowly gets used to something and gives you a bit more dopamine each time. So if you're looking to suddenly get fit, don't do 100 or 200 crunches today. Start with 10, because sometimes 10 is better than none. And often the brain will postpone things until it thinks it can do it. So start with something small. But Crystal, you had a slightly different perspective, which I love too.
Yeah, and for me, like, not all brains work with the linear process. Like the little by little, like, works for me personally, and it sounds like it works for you as well. But I think that, like, finding a non-linear way of seeing progress is really important. And what do I mean by that? Like with the exercise example, it's not just about focusing on the number of crunches that you're doing, but perhaps the fact that you got to the gym that day at all. Like the low-hanging fruit approach can kind of trick yourself into moving through those emotions that are really negative and adversive. And when I was studying for my PhD, that was something that I had to do. I had to trick myself into actually writing my thesis. One day I would open the file and that was it. And then the next day I opened the file and I put a title and I closed it. And then the next day I got page numbers. And then the next day it was the lowest hanging fruit. And I didn't focus on whether or not I was accomplishing anything, just that I had done one more thing. And then suddenly I got into a flow state because I was changing the wording and adding on. And I'd written half a chapter in one day accidentally without really meaning to.
And just building on that, I think where we both landed when we talked about it is, what we both say is give yourself a reward at the end of that, meaning have a think about the things that give you dopamine that you do find interesting and enjoy. You know, I've been talking with some people who say, I feel so guilty. I'm watching so much more Netflix than I ever have before. Surely I should be doing the cobwebs and cleaning up my house. Well, that needs to get done, but also be aware that what you're doing there a little bit is self-medicating, meaning just having a little bit of dopamine, a little relaxed for them on the couch. For others, it's going to be running. For others, it's going to be, you know, something. But whatever it is that gives you some joy or some dopamine for a neuroscientist, make sure you're deliberately adding that into your life at the moment. Because as we go through
right
this
now,
change, we're still getting dopamine.
Sorry to talk over you, Mish. I just had an idea. Right now, me time looks very different. Right? Like before the pandemic, me time could look like, oh, spending the whole weekend at home in your apartment. But it's about finding
I'm having
right?
me time all the time at the moment.
All the time. So you might actually need something different. So it's really about experimenting and finding that new reward, that new sweet spot, I think.
Yeah, playing with it a little bit.
Great. Just one final question. And both Singularity University Portugal and Nova SPE are working mainly with companies. Of course, companies are made of people, but what would be your advice for companies to prepare their co-workers to develop these kinds of skills and that have an enormous importance in times like this that we are living right now?
And that's a big topic and a big conversation. And I think, in fact, in a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to be back doing another talk at the invitation of Nova. I'm talking about exactly that. But as an initial idea, a lot of teams on the surface have actually coped with the last few weeks quite well. And I don't know if you've seen examples. I've watched in amazement at the Singularity team and how they've been through the change. But right around the world, we're seeing examples of, whether it's Canada, let's practice spontaneous acts of kindness. We're seeing in different companies, teams jumping into virtual meetings and all these things. That's been really positive. But what's been driving that is a crisis and the team leaning in to solve the crisis together. What's going to be an interesting question for leaders and for companies in particular is, as we start to stabilize and people get used to week 1, week 2, week 3, now just working from home, there are going to be some bigger questions around how can we reintroduce a sense of meaning and purpose as we work from home. Some people have been doing this for a long time. There are lots of people who've been working from home, it turns out. And when you talk to them, they have quite strong skills in self-motivation, self-organization, self-management, and they're also very proactive with their other social relationships to make sure that they have some support around them. For those of us who've been used to working in an office, we need all those things that we used to get from home. And as we get over this first, adjustment period, it's going to be more and more important for teams to start to work together to reintroduce some of that meaning. Crystal, any thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, I was just thinking that social innovation is something that I think leaders should consider. Like, yes, you've moved in response to the crisis, but when you're talking about a prolonged sort of sustained progress or new way of being, how can you make sure that you keep people engaged and interested and growing? And I don't think that every leader needs to be this creative genius that suddenly responds unconventionally to the new normal, but leaning in and listening to your people about what really works for them and then incorporating that into the solution that you're devising for your team, I think is a really great way of thinking about responding to the long-term effects of the sudden changes that we've all had to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes it's not about the leader having the answer, it's about knowing the right question to ask. And now more than ever, there's lots of people with a whole lot more free time because they're not commuting to work in the mornings or home. How can we support really positive conversations amongst the team to solve the problem together? I love that.
So, and that will lead us to the other webinar that we are going to do next 22nd of April, 6 p.m. again with Misha, about leadership at a distance. And we invite you all to join us. Thank you, Misha and Crystal, for this amazing presentation. I would like just to remember that this is part of the World campaign promoted by Nova SPE, available at www.worldtoplay.novaspe.pt. Don't forget to attend to the other sessions, and thank you for being with us. Happy Easter and keep safe. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, you too.
Bye.
Hello.